right, welcome to another episode of the Mountaineer Farm Talk. If you've joined in the past, you know we have great topics that cover all sorts of um, parts of agriculture, gardening, hay production, uh, cattle production, so even maybe next week a little bit of poultry production. So we try to cover as many topics in the field of agriculture as we can, and we're glad to have you with us this week on the Mountaineer Farm Talk, the voice of West Virginia agriculture. And we're joined today with my co-host, partner Evan Williams here, Cabell County.
Yep, Evan Wilson here in Cabell and Wayne counties, and excited to have these guests here today to talk a little bit about stockpiling our forages for this fall.
And we have a great lineup too with a doctor. Both of them are doctors, Dr. Kevin Schaefer and Dr. Ed Rayburn. Kevin's our beef specialist, and Ed Rayburn, you've seen him before. You know him, you love him. He's coming from Morgantown, West Virginia. And he needs no introduction. He's been called the John Wick of forages. So with that, we welcome both of you, and definitely they bring a lot to the table. So stockpiling, it's not a new thing. But it is something that can add value definitely to our pastures. So I'll start with Dr. Rayburn. Dr. Rayburn, for those out there that's not familiar with stockpiling, what is stockpiling?
Stockpiling is taking a piece of pasture or fenced hay ground that has predominantly tall fescue in it that we're going to save for grazing in the late fall or early winter. And I emphasize the fescue because if we're going to put major management into it, we want to be working with tall fescue since it's the one that'll stand up the best in cold weather, snow, that sort of thing, into the late fall and early winter.
Okay, and there's different types of tall fescue out there. Do you have any preference, just kind of while we're talking about tall fescue, as far as some of the endophyte friendly, endophyte free, besides this Kentucky 31 we see all over the hillsides in West Virginia?
Well, I guess I'm going to start with the one I have. And if it happens to be Kentucky 31, then I want to use it. I do think producers ought to look at their situation and ask the question, can they justify going to an improved fescue? If I'm at lower elevations, that's under 2,000 feet, or especially if I'm over on the eastern part of the state on a shale soil, or even down your way at the real low elevations, I would consider looking at one of the new friendly endophyte tall fescues. Those are the ones that tolerate the heat and the drought the best. So I know down there in the southwest corner of the state, you can have drought. You've got pretty good soils. If you get over in the eastern part of the state on the shales, they have drought plus the shale soils. And over there, if they're going to go to an improved fescue, it really needs to be one that has the friendly endophyte in it. Now, if you're up at higher elevations like Preston County, where I am, the endophyte-free fescue seems to work pretty good up here at the high elevations. We've got the cool weather, the moisture. On the other hand, if you're going to go into renovating and do a new seeding, even at this elevation, seriously look at the improved friendly endophyte fescues, just because of what they can add in terms of stand longevity.
Okay, well, thank you. And for the guys that are in the western side, we done a tall fescue trial for what, 3 to 4 years, it seems like there. And we got a lot of data off of it. And we looked at Select, Max Q, Texoma, Bar Optima, and Kentucky 31 with 3 reps there with those 5 varieties. And, you know, now we looked at a hay cutting situation. This was not a pasture situation. You get into more different management practices with that grazing than just cutting and then letting regrow. And we didn't really see that much of a statistical difference between those in the western side of the state. So I think, you know, if you're doing it for hay fields, I think that all those were great. And but if you're pasturing these tall fescues, you may want to look in a little bit closer to some that's going to be a little bit more hardier. And the ones with the endophytes, you know, on our side of the state, I think are going to be a little bit hardier. And they work well. But like Dr. Rayburn, I think you said you had Select on your property, right? At your farm personally?
Yes.
And he does a wonderful job with the management with that grazing. And, you know, he gets it to, you know, stick around. But if you do not manage that Select, it will disappear on you. But I think, and am I out of line with saying that, or is that pretty much?
Well, and I would agree with you. You're down in a stressful situation. Now, on the positive side, under grazing, under good grazing, fescue will do even better than it does in a hayfield situation.
Okay.
Fescue is not really the type of grass that does real good on hay unless you're going to cut it at least 3 times, preferably 4 times a year. I've forgotten how many times you were cutting that experiment.
We were just doing it 2 because most of my guys get 2. Sometimes they get 3, but we were babying it a little bit, you know, with the 2 cuttings instead of trying to push that 3rd one.
And that's a good place where fescue works. If you can take 2 cuts of hay and then stockpile the 3rd cut. If you get a cut late May, early June, another cut sometime late July, early August. If you can get that 2nd cut off by the 15th of August, and then hit it with some nitrogen and pray for the rain, get the rain, and then have that there for grazing in December and January.
And you answered one of my questions already. What time should we be looking at that? So that answered that question. Kevin, getting back to you, you're kind of, don't mean to leave you out over here. Let's throw you in the ball game here. What do these cattle, you know, look like grazing on these stockpile pastures, and what might be the difference between some of these endophyte friendlies versus that Kentucky 31 you see in these cattle grazing?
Well, it's in terms of what the cattle look like grazing a stockpile. That the question to answer that, it really depends. It depends on the class of animal you're working with, what your goals are, and then of course on the nutritive value of that stockpile. So, you know, and part of the nutritive value of the stockpile depends on when the stockpiling started. So when did that growth occur? So the maturity of that forage as it goes in to the dormant season. But I would say in general, and thinking of this in terms of mature cows, that stockpile is, especially with the tall fescue that we're talking about and its ability to maintain nutritive value longer through the dormant season. You obviously, most producers can probably see a significant difference between our other major cool season grass and orchard grass and fescue, and how frost impacts those 2 forages, and that orchard grass just kind of melts to a degree and goes to the ground, and you know, and then becomes unusable to the animal. But as I said, in general, we're going to be a higher quality with our stockpile than we would be on a hay that we would replace a grazable forage with. So you actually see a much better body condition on mature cows that are grazing stockpiled forage in general than you would with most hays that are the average hay that we're going to see a producer supplying to those animals. So, and as far as dealing with, say, calves or replacement females that are going to move into a stockpile, something else that's going to be retained through winter, or we're going, say, stocker cattle. Again, we have a higher plane of nutrition. We may need to buy a supplement to match those animals' needs. But if we have a more nutrient dense forage that we can supply through grazing, then what we have to purchase to add to that to balance a ration is going to be significantly less cost and probably in less volume in terms of fed to the animal. So that's how I would look at it from what are we seeing on the animal side in terms of performance and condition. It's generally going to be better than the feeds we're replacing it with.
Okay, and it'd probably be a good thing to do a little forage sampling and testing there with that stockpile, wouldn't you say? That way we kind of know what to supplement. Is that right?
Absolutely, and particularly with animal classes that we're going to really be concerned about performance with. Okay, so if we're looking at young growing animals, absolutely. Now I would say, and Dr. Rayburn can add to this, but if we're looking more at a mature cow, all right, and a dry cow in mid gestation, we are at as about a low of maintenance requirement cow as we're going to see throughout the year, because she's not lactating. At mid gestation, we have weaned that calf. So, and that we're not getting close enough to calving for her nutrient requirements to start to increase again as she prepares to begin lactation again. So, we don't need a tremendously high quality feed at that point in time for those animals. And so we can really, on a mature cow basis, kind of, if we monitor body condition and what those cows are doing, we can adjust as long as we're keeping a consistent eye on cow body condition without necessarily that. But I think forage testing would almost always pays for itself, absolutely. But I would say in my mind, I would save that for those animal classes where I'm really trying to manage performance on, and I can use from a mature cow standpoint, probably monitoring body condition score as a way to assess where my forage is at. And then it's also how you're managing the harvest of that forage with those animals and what the level of nutrition they are taking out of that forage is. We can change that in how we manage the grazing of that stockpile as well. What we take for a clip forage sample may not be exactly what those animals are consuming out of there, and be a similar in nutritional profile to the animals, what our forage result would say.
But that gives you a baseline to kind of somewhat go on. Okay.
In general, the forage sample that we would collect, I would say this, and Dr. Rayburn can correct me on this, but I would say it is probably going to be of lower quality than what the animal actually consumes, because the animal inherently understands how to select those things that are going to be more nutritious and more nutrient dense for it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Could I jump in for just a minute? I agree with everything Kevin said there. This time of the time of year we're feeding that fescue stockpile is getting that cow ready to calve. So body condition is a key factor to keep an eye on. I do think there's a lot of merit to the forage testing. When we've looked at the economics, farmers usually, if they take a forage test and then use it to manage the system, they're usually saving $10 for every dollar they invest in the forage test. And especially with this fescue early in the winter, it's just like Kevin said, it's probably the highest quality forage you have on the farm. And if you've also forage tested your hay, if you have some late cut, first cut hay that's low in quality, you might want to use this fescue as the protein supplement to go along with that late cut hay. So the fescue, if you fertilized it with nitrogen in August, it may be the protein supplement that you want to use with that late cut hay. And the advantage of the late cut hay fed on the fescue, it slows down the rate of passage of that fescue, and the cows actually get more out of that high quality fescue grass. So we're not trying to make rocket science out of this, but I'll say farmers are pretty smart, and looking at that forage test and comparing it to what the cow needs, it's fairly simple to start getting to where you can see how to balance hay and the stockpile, so you actually get the best out of both of them. Now, you don't have to have hay with the stockpile, but a lot of times we do have this lower quality hay, and I'm just emphasizing that if we know what the quality of the stockpile is, we might be able to, it can actually be the equivalent of $150 a ton second cut hay. So that's the value of forage testing, and then using that forage test on your hay and your pasture just to get the most out of it during the winter time.
Okay.
And I think that's a really important point that we need to bring out of this is we often think of and those people that do stockpiling and trying to extend the grazing season of getting the merit badge for who can graze the latest into the coming year, and without feeding hay. And we need to think of that as you just said, that it's not when you start feeding hay, it's the total hay fed per cow that is important economically. So using hay in concert with your stockpiled forage can be sometimes the most effective strategy of supplying nutrients to your animals and getting the most value out of your stockpile and actually extend that grazing period, particularly for where you all are at on the higher river and typically not having a significant snow cover where you cannot or issues of accessing that stockpile, that you're using that hay as a means to help further that stockpile rather than just as once that stockpile is gone, then we start to a full hay ration and we change nutrient availability to those animals significantly, with that diet change.
Well, you kind of led me into the next topic. Now, Ed, did you have anything you wanted to add to that part?
Let me just throw in the other side. I have seen situations also with fescue that wasn't nitrogen fertilized, but had good growth because of the weather during the fall. And then you get off into late winter when that fescue is starting to brown off a little bit. Again, this is where forage testing can come in handy. Some of that hay, late deferred hay, can be low in protein. And sometimes a little bit of a protein supplement is going to give the cow, or really the rumen bacteria, the kick they need to get the most out of that fescue when it is in a low quality situation. And that I described it. It would be fescue that was grown without any significant nitrogen fertilization. And once you get back off into February and early March after it's weathered. So it can be both ends of the scale depending on how it was managed.
Okay. And I'll put in a blurb. I always like to put in a blurb here for the conservation districts. In the Western Conservation District here, you're allowed 2 free hay samples and 2 free what they call grab samples, which is just your cut and slash forage samples. there that would kind of coincide with the stockpiling here. So you do have that as an option. Now, they do not do the 30-hour ruminant test that Dr. Rayburn likes to see. That kind of, that it's in there longer. It's a little bit different chemistry. It kind of relates a little bit closer to what you see in that environment in the rumen with that 30-hour test. And if you are paying for a test, I always go with Dr. Rayburn's recommendation, do the 30-hour test. So, but if you are getting the free test, you can't really, dictate on what they're doing for you for free. They have a set test that they use, but it is not the 30-hour test. But if you are paying for it, the 30-hour test is a little bit better. So I always like to say something about hay testing or soil testing. I was brought up under the great Rodney Wall-Brown. So no matter what conversation you're having, it's either soil testing or hay testing was mentioned. So there's my hay testing blurb there. Evan, you look like you have a question.
Yeah, I do. We got a couple questions here in the chat box. We monitor that. They want to remind about the recommended wait time to feed fescue after that frost we get this fall. And then the Northern Panhandle Conservation District gives a cost share for forage sampling as well.
Deal. And I think the frost, now, would that be more with Johnson grass than fescue?
That's going to be an issue. If you have a pasture that has a lot of Johnson grass in it, then I'd be a little concerned about frost on the Johnson grass. But as long as the Johnson grass has been killed and had enough time to dry out, just think of the Johnson, once the Johnson grass is totally dead and dry, think of it as just dry standing hay out there in the fescue field.
Okay, awesome.
Now, if you don't have any Johnson grass, I don't know of any other plant out there that you have to be concerned about the frost.
Okay.
Kevin,
there would be some. Yeah, there would be some issues when you're talking about. We have some people that are no-tilling into some hay ground with like some sorghum Sudan grasses or those kind of things. And so if you're dealing with those in frost, you're going to end up with the same kind of issues as you would with Johnson grass. Those warm season grasses that are going to have that issue. But as far as our cool season grasses and frost, there's not an issue on consumption of those.
Yeah, and I was thinking of a permanent, an established stand of fescue.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thanks for bringing up those other plants.
Now, another topic kind of relates to what we've already been talking on. We touched on it a little bit. When you talk about the, production of the tall fescue with low nitrogen, we talk about maybe fertilizing there in August to get that stand, for those cattle coming back to it later. How much fertilizer per acre are we looking for?
Okay, my recommendation comes back to how much forage you need. I use the recommendation of 50 to 100 pounds of N per acre. Now, you do want to make sure that you've soil tested, that your P and your K is up in the optimum range. If they're not in the optimum range, you need to add the appropriate phosphorus and potassium fertilizer to go with it. I would not apply more than 100 pounds of N. And if you have a lot of acres, you're better off applying 50 pounds per acre over the acreage than trying to ramp up the nitrogen too much. On part of your acreage, you can actually use the clover in the stand to be the nitrogen source. And that's going to give you the equivalent of 50 pounds of N at least in that fall growth. But if you're relying on the clover, make sure that you graze that part of the fescue off before you get the hard freezing weather. You want to get the cows in there, let them at least graze off the clover part so you don't lose it. Because when you get those hard freezes, that clover melts away and you lose that part of the yield. The value of the nitrogen is stimulating the grass, which can tolerate the cold weather. It's going to suppress your clover in the fall, but in the long run, it doesn't have any major negative impact, at least from my experience. But just something to think about.
Well, let's get back to Kevin then. What about grazing this this stockpile we have out there? You know, we're going to have a lot of hoof traffic coming through. You know, you got mature grasses in some areas, you know, tromping it down. What is the most cost-effective and efficient way to actually graze this stockpile pasture? I know it's going to be different because every farm is different management. So that's going to be one of those depends. But, you know, what's your top three?
Yeah, it's absolutely, it's dependent upon the individual's time availability, you know, from a pasture perspective, where's water located, how, you know, water sources, how are you managing those? And of course, as we move into those cooler times of the year, we reduce some water requirements on cattle. So, and with that, we can increase the distance that animals necessarily may have to travel to water a little bit as well when we get into those colder times of the year. So it's highly dependent upon, again, your goals of the individual farm, the landscape you're dealing with, what your resources are. I am a huge proponent, though, of rationing this out using temporary fence in whatever means that best fits your scenario. Absolutely, you know, it's very easy from a producer perspective to look and see 300 bales in a barn or in a stack, okay? And to go out there and see that stockpiled forage, it's the exact same thing. It's just not rolled up in a bale. That is a hay pile that gets you through the winter. And so it's a matter, I think it's more of a context of changing your thought process about what the forage is. You know, that stockpiled forage in a way is probably the most valuable forage that you grow during the year, because it is replacing hay that you would have to have instead of something that you could graze. And so when you take an animal from grazing and you have to completely replace their ration with something else, it's the most expensive feed that you will buy. And so that stockpile forage. So we really do need to make sure that we are doing the best management practices to get the highest utilization of that forage, because it is so valuable. And I think that comes down to temporary fence. I like, when applicable, to strip graze it away from water, you know, allocating, say, a day's worth of forage at a time with a strip as we move away from a water source. And because the shorter of those graze periods that we can use, we can help improve our utilization rate of the forage. So, you know, to take a 10-acre meadow that you have stockpiled and just turn cows on that until it's gone, you're going to get trampling loss. You're going to get loss from soiling of manure and urine that they're not going to consume, and your utilization rate of that highly valuable stockpiled forage is going to be significantly less than if we ration that out on an every day or every other day basis using temporary fence. So I can't give you necessarily specifics, because it's going to change with each situation, but I'd say we need to, and definitely use as short of graze periods as possible that is practical for us in our scenario, and do that using temporary fence.
And to get that measurement of how much you need in the day, and I'll bounce this one back to Dr. Rayburn's court here. You have a pasture stick, and you've come out to many of my field days, and you're reaching over. I guarantee you he's got one close. So you never want to make Dr. Rayburn mad, because he's got usually about a 3.5 foot stick in his hand at most times. and that's that grazing stick. How do you utilize that to tell how much forage you have out there to give that cow or set of cows enough forage to graze through that 1 or 2 days?
Okay.
And I know
Best
it's hard
thing
to
is-
say this without seeing the stick, really up close, but,
Well, if you use the stick or the pasture plate, you really ought to measure the forage accumulation late October, early November, because that's the point at which 95% of the grass growth or more has occurred. And I'd rather do it at that point in time than say January 1st after snow's hit on it, because our calibrations for the stick or the plate meter are for stands that have not been laid down by snow. Once it's been laid down by snow, it's hard to use a pasture stick. So go in there late October, early November, get a feeling for how much forage is there. Now, Kevin hit it right on the head. If you can do a 1-day stay, that's kind of the ideal. Some people are going to say even shorter than that, but on a practical basis, I think a 1-day stay is the most practical short stay. If you can't do it, if you can't change the fence that frequently, then no, 2 to 3 day stay isn't that bad. To make it easy, I like to set up 2 wires. No, have 2 temporary fences. Have the one. Okay, let's say I'm doing a 2-day stay. So I'm going to have the wire that is holding the cattle back right now. Then I'm going to have another wire out there that all I have to do is take up this first wire, and the cows move into the fresh pasture. Then I'm going to take that wire that I just took up and put it over for the next time period. So I'm going to actually have 2 wires sitting out there in the field at any one time. Now, based on that initial forage assessment or just a good eyeball, if I don't have snow there, I'd like to leave at least the bottom stubble with a little bit of leaf on that stubble when the cows leave. Now for a dry cow or cow in, dry cow in that last part of gestation, taking it down to that 2 to 3 inch height isn't going to hurt the cow or the grass that much. Now you don't want to be grazing into that lower stubble because that's where the carbohydrate reserves are for that grass and actually the new leaf that's going to come out in April. So leave at least 2 inches, 3 inches. And a good way to think of it is if you see a little bit of green leaf on that tiller, that's good. If you've taken off all the green leaf that's on the tip of that tiller, you've grazed it too tight. And so if you go out there and you see I left a whole lot of green leaf, then you gave them probably a little bit too much area. If you didn't leave any green leaf, you probably gave them, okay, how did I say that? If you left a lot of green leaf, you gave them too much. If you don't see any green leaf on those tillers, you gave them too little, and you should give them a bigger area for that next grazing stay. So that's the way I'd answer that, John.
Okay. All right. Evan Wilson.
Yep, I'm here.
Very quiet.
That's here. I got up and went and got my forage stick there for a little bit when you brought that up. So what are some other species of grasses we can look at for stockpiling aside from fescue that might be of interest for some producers, maybe in the sheep side or goat side or horses or other ruminants?
what you've
Yeah.
got.
What you've got, make it work.
And Kevin's completely correct. Just remember that many, and Kevin also added to it, if you have orchard grass, you can stockpile it, but you better use it up pretty quick because it's going to melt on you. Smooth brome grass, Timothy, they're going to go dormant and turn brown even if it doesn't frost.
And not to interrupt you, Ed, there, but
Go for it.
this is just a thought process of mine, and you can critique it as we just discuss it openly here. But you know, we often have a lot of times, especially this time of year, that producers will want to clip pastures or brush hog pastures and take some of the mature dead forage that's standing up taller out of there. Mostly it's just for aesthetic reasons. But in terms of stockpiling, I think there's tremendous value in having some of those dead stems there, because it helps hold that forage when we have things that, like orchard grass and some of those other things that are very subject to frost. And then once they get on that soil surface, that wet soil surface with that first heavy wet snow, and they begin to decay. But if we leave those mature stems, those fescue stems, those orchard grass stems out there in those bunch grasses, and especially like if we have some warm season grasses, you know, my place right now, the big blue stem is coming up like crazy, and you know, those kind of grasses, you know, when you see that first frost, those leaves start to go away pretty fast. But if you have those stems that can help hold those things up off the soil surface so they don't decay, I think that helps us with some of those forages that don't stockpile as well as tall fescue does, or handle that freeze thaw frost as well as tall fescue does.
Let me add to what Kevin's saying there. If I have some cool season grasses mixed in there, the cows are actually going to sometimes seek out that stemmy material. You'll see that. If I have a whole pasture that's really succulent and lush, you'll see cows go into the fence line looking for stems because they want more roughage. And so there's a lot of merit to what Kevin's saying there in the total picture.
Okay.
And I think that follows right with our animal management. And this is throughout any time of the year, but it's monitoring manure. And you know, and how do we balance the diet based on what that manure is telling us? And in the situation Ed just described, you're going to see an animal that's very loose, and they're seeking out that roughage to help balance their diet. And
Yep.
I started a little trend there on the ridge, because what I do is, and my neighbors thought I was crazy at first, you know, right when I turn cattle in the springtime, you know, right when I turn them in, it's good flush grass, you know, it's coming out the back end as fast as it goes in them. I always get some more stemmier hay, higher far, you know, I wouldn't say trashier hay, but, you know, high far, you know, NPK or whatever, you know, the lower quality hay, and put out there and let them nibble at it. And that long stem hay, and kind of, you know, it's high in fiber, is the word I was looking for just a second ago. High in fiber, it kind of slows that rumen down and lets them digest it. And that's kind of what we talked about with the stockpiling, feeding the hay to slow it down a little bit. So, you know, even that springtime, when you turn that cattle out, you got nice flush grass, you know, it's a little immature. That some of that long stem hay might come in handy too there. But that kind of gets me around what we're talking about, holding those plants up, that stemmier, you know, plants or stage plants out there. What about, and I know this might be a Rakesh question, what about these weeds right now? I'm going to see how dogbane stockpiles here shortly, because I've noticed the dogbane
Mhm.
coming up in my hay patch or my pastures, and I move these cattle to another pasture, and they're not going to come back here to October. So that dog bane is going to get a jump. It's kind of like that hay field. Usually you don't see that dog bane in a constant grazing situation. But what about these dog bane ironweeds in this stockpile pasture? Is a little bit acceptable? Do we need to try to just get those knocked out? I mean, what's your opinion there?
Okay, dog, this is based on experience and not anything else, okay? uh, Cattle on my farm, I've not seen them eat dog bane during the heat of the summer. But in a stockpile situation after frost, they seem to go after it. So dog bane and milkweed to me are not weeds. Well, okay, during the heat of the summer, I look at dog bane as a weed, but I'm not going to put an effort into killing it. But then, no, there in the after frost, the cattle eat it and no, do well. So now ironweed, cattle will nip on ironweed, but I've not seen them do a whole lot. Although I'm going to go back to Fred Provenza on this. Ironweed is a bitter weed, and it's my understanding from Fred that it's like aspirin. If you take an aspirin and bite into it, you know how bitter an aspirin is. And some animals will, as Fred says, self-medicate. And I've had an animal that was had a sore hoof, and just that animal seemed to pick on the ironweed. And again, this is observation and listening to Fred Provenza. I think that animal was self-medicating on the ironweed. No hard data, just other than what the research Fred has done out there at Utah State in terms of the chemistry of plants and what animals do in terms of the chemistry of plants. But in terms of stockpile feed, I don't look at ironweed as being a major food source. Now for sheep, that might be a different issue because sheep have a reputation for eating ironweed pretty well.
That's what you were mentioning earlier, Kevin, about people coming by and clipping their pastures right now. That's what a lot of people down my way are doing. They're clipping to knock out our nice ironweed stands we've accumulated over the last 10, 15 years.
Well, it's a feel-good process too,
Yep.
because it's not eliminating the ironweed.
No.
There's some really neat work being done by a lady from New Zealand called named Nicole Masters. Where she's looking at these things, and I've seen some presentations that she's done. The species that are there are telling you something about your management. Okay, and what you're and mostly they're telling us where we've messed up, if we've got weed problems and those kind of things. So I'd recommend people to look at her to some of those things, but in most of it, we can correct a lot of those things with appropriate grazing management. But I think it's important to note that species diversity in your pastures is an asset. That we need those things. Forbs being present is of tremendous value. So we often can get in the mindset of just wanting to have that beautiful grass stand, and that's not the most healthy thing for the animal, for the soil, for the environment. We want those diversity of species in there. And I can give you an example right now, a producer I've worked with through this summer, where we have taken what was traditional hay land and grazed it this year. And they just went across the second pass on grazing. They grazed in May, and there were a significant amount of milkweed in there. and those cows stripped those milkweeds. I mean, absolutely peeled the bloom, every leaf off of them. There's just stems standing out there. To me, when an animal can't or when a plant can't do any photosynthesis because it has no more leaf area, that's as effective control for that plant as we could possibly have. But it is a major pollinator species as well. So we're not going to eliminate it, but it's a food source.
Right.
You know, those animals are getting nutrition from it. So, you know, having that around is, you know, it's a matter of changing our perspective a little bit. Do we want to have the most desirable species there for our animals to consume? Yes. And as many as those as we can. But remember, that's not just one or two. That's a multitude of species that we need with diversity in in our sward.
Absolutely.
Can I say something about milkweed? I've seen cattle at the same age of growth. Cattle, in my experience, will eat the milkweed before they'll eat the alfalfa.
Well, that was neat about this scenario, Ed, is we had, this is young cow-calf pairs, 2-year-old cow-calf pairs that are grazing this, a group of them. The first field is 5 acres. And it was, you know, we're right in the middle of May, so we're having significant rapid growth. We're moving toward seed heads on our cool season grasses very fast. And so they grazed this 5-acre piece first, and it was a little less mature. Then they went into a 12-acre hay field and grazed it, strip grazed it. And that field was much more mature. I mean, just in a week's time, you know, different maturity rates. And when they grazed their second pass in the first field, they ate the milkweed before they ate the grass.
Mm-hmm.
But there was enough difference, even though in the recovery of those species and I would say probably some of the sugar levels in those plants, that when they moved to the second field, they ate the grass before the milkweed, but they still ate the milkweed. So, you know, so much of managing your grazing is using the power of observation.
And we did
I
have a
agree.
question in the chat box here.
Yep.
Could you repeat the lady's name there that done the study with the ironweed?
Nicole Masters. It's not with ironweed, but she's done a few. You could Nicole Masters is her name. You can find those presentations on YouTube. She's also done a few podcasts that are pretty neat, and talking about Brix levels in plants, which is a neat concept as well, using a refractometer to look at what some of the sugar levels are in plants. And comparatively, when you look at some of those Brix measurements in weeds versus the grass species that are in a pasture, and you will understand why an animal selects the weed, what we view as a weed, first, because there's more nutritive value in some of those plants than what the grass has.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And Evan put a link up as well in the chat box to YouTube there as well. You know, I like stockpiling, you know, pastures, because that gives me kind of like body condition score, an eyeball. I soil test, you know, I know where the nutrients are and where they're not, but, you know, going out there and seeing where the grass grows a little better, you know, better over here and not as well over here. And, you know, we can kind of take some of this. And what do you think about this? I know Dr. Rayburn is a component of bale grazing, and usually where I have those stockpile pastures is where I'm going to overwinter my cattle there. You know, would you kind of eyeball that, and with soil samples as well to back you up, to kind of figure out where to do a little bale grazing at after you get through with the stockpile pasture there, Dr. Rayburn?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that question, please, John?
You know, when you're stockpiling, you can kind of see some of the poorer areas. You know, the grass doesn't grow as well. And a lot of times, the area you stockpile your pastures, bringing them to later in the years where you're going to winter those animals. This is a good time to maybe look at, you know, bale grazing some of those poor areas on your farm, after the stockpiling, right?
Either after stockpiling or possibly in conjunction with the stockpile, if you're strip grazing. But yes, there are hay bales have a lot of fertility in them, and you want to make the best use of that fertility. And that's where it's beneficial to have your soil test done the previous year, so you know what your fertility status on your fields are, and then concentrate your bale grazing in areas that need to have fertility built up. Now, hay bales especially are going to carry a lot of potassium, and so you want to get that manure and urine from that hay back on hay fields if possible, or in a pasture that could benefit from that potassium. And it comes back to what Kevin said, observation is important. If I put the hay bales out in the middle of a field, you're going to get a lot of manure there, especially in good weather. But if you have bad weather, the animals are going to bed over near a windbreak of some type. And so you're going to get a lot of manure and urine deposited there too. So the other thing I've seen is there'll be high spots in the field where the cattle like to bed. So the only way you can really pick that out is get out there, watch the cows, watch where the manure is being deposited, so that you have a feel for, where are the cows putting this fertilizer, and how can you best manage your bales and your mineral feeder. If you have a mineral feeder out there, that's also what we call an attractor, something the cattle will come to and tend to put more manure in the vicinity of that mineral feeder. So those are tricks that you can play with to get that manure distributed around the field, be it a hay field or a pasture, where you need to get that fertility.
Okay, and on average, I know I've kind of learned from you over the years, every ton of hay is going to give you about 12 pounds of P2O5 and 40 pounds of K2O with every ton of hay that you feed. So, half that bale, you're kind of getting back in fertilizer. And so you can kind of fertilize your pastures with this scenario that Dr. Rayburn was talking about. And a cow will give you $1 a day in manure, the last figures we saw. So, when we talk about soil sampling, I tell the kids, if somebody tells you BS ain't worth anything, you tell them it's worth $1 a day. So there's probably a lot of parents out there that doesn't like me, so they probably use that at home. So I haven't heard any complaints yet, though. But no, we're kind of back end here. Any last things you can think of that you want to add into the stockpiling and grazing there?
Well, I guess if Ed doesn't mind, I'll go first on this. I think just to quickly detail onto what Ed just mentioned, using those attractors, using where you place bales, that's also an excellent tool to work on places where you do have invasive species that you want to control, because you can use the trample effect of the animals. If you've got a patch of blackberries that you can set that bale in and get that trample effect, or your mineral feeder. If you've got if you're coming into in summer now and you've got a thick patch of hemp dog bane, and you've got one of these small mineral feeders that you move with the animals, and you can throw it in the middle of that patch of hemp dog bane, and use the animals to help you control some of those things. But I would, as a general theme, I would, back to kind of wrapping up, I would say that as far as stockpiling forage, yeah, we can think about it and do it now, but if we're going to do it well, it needs to be thought out in advance of the growing season and part of our grazing plan. We need to develop a plan to do that. And part of that grazing plan has to do with what our stocking rate is. Okay. And so, you know, we have two things. All right. Our carrying capacity, or how much grass we grow, that's our forage supply. And then we have stocking rate, and how many animals, how many mouths we put on that. That's our demand on that forage supply. And we cannot stock our property or our boundary, whatever it is, at the level of our summer, spring flush grazing or forage supply, that carrying capacity, with a year-round herd of animals and expect to stockpile forage, because our demand is eating up everything that we grow during this time and prior throughout the year, through the growing season. So it's managing animal class with stocking rate. It's also having, in general, herds that are disposable, that can leave, that help you match stocking rate and carrying capacity throughout the season. So we have the ability to take care of that spring flush. But then we also have animals that are leaving about this time of year, so we can take demand off pastures from the 1st to the 15th of August and begin to have that opportunity to grow stockpile. So it comes in, you know, the ability to do this comes in the planning process and how you choose to stock your property with that, your stocking rate. Because if we can try our darndest, but if we put our stocking rate too high with a year-round herd of animals, we're not going to be able to stockpile and extend the grazing season. So that would be my things to kind of wrap up. That, you know, and understand that it's not a recipe. We can't give you a list of do this, do this, do this, and it'll work on your property. All right. You have to learn some concepts and principles and then adjust and apply as they fit within your production system and your land base that you're working. So I'll turn it over to Ed and let him add.
All I'm going to say is Kevin did a good job wrapping it up.
There you go. There you go. Hey, well, thank you both for joining in today with us to talk about grazing stockpiles and managing these stockpile pastures. And this is a great opportunity, you know, for all farmers to, you know, maybe save a little bit on the back end by letting the cattle harvest that last cutting of hay for them, and to give them a little bit more grazing going into the winter. Thank you so much. Thank you, Evan, for joining in too with me and partnering up. JJ is still out. He is recovering well. I think he is moved from a walker to a cane now with his hip. So he's actually back to where he was before the surgery, and hopefully keeps improving and getting better and better. So he's still healing up, but he will be back in a few weeks. And we'll be glad to have him back and see him again. Well, thank you so much for joining in with us today. And till next time, we'll see you around the ridge.